Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari ST A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari ST games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the former. Today we're looking at Asteroids Deluxe, which was a 1987 release from Atari UK, I believe, developed by Paradox Software. This is another one of Atari's extremely late 16-bit versions of its arcade classics, and interestingly, unlike any of the other versions of Asteroids that were released on Atari platforms, this is actually a port of Asteroids Deluxe rather than the original Asteroids. So while it eschews the vector style graphics of the original arcade machines in favour of some sort of Atari 7800 style animated asteroids that look very nice, it does include gameplay elements not seen in other home ports of the game, such as the multi-part enemies that split into different bits and home in on you. They were exclusively an Asteroids Deluxe thing, so you can find them in this Atari ST version. Now, in a prime example of review scores being stupid and pointless, ST Action's review of Asteroids Deluxe commented that you can't go wrong with this one, buy it, and then gave it a rating of 43%. Too much space, perhaps. Anyway, I've actually got a copy of this one here. So this is the box for the UK version. It comes in this sort of cassette style box that most of the Atari games, the Paradox ports mainly, from this era came in. So we've got a nice bit of cover art there and a bit of blurb on the back. Let's see what it says. Asteroids plunge at you, trapped in a gigantic cloud of asteroids. Your struggling spaceship hurls towards its doom. You'll have to pulverize all the asteroids with your photon cannon to save your ship and your life. Rubble from an exploding asteroid bounces off your ship's hull. A glowing blur flashes across your viewing screen. So that's where the rubble came from. The asteroid was blasted by an alien robot saucer. Groups of alien robot drones group together to weather the asteroid storm until your cannons disturb them. Once their protective formation is broken, they home onto your ship. Your shields weaken, then disappear altogether. More rubble hits your ship. Its hull rings like a bell. If you don't get busy, that could be your death knell. And all that. Anyway, yeah, so there's not much to these packages. There's just one floppy disk in there. Asteroids Deluxe rather than Deluxe. And a very, very rudimentary manual inside the inlay. So it's not a separate leaflet or anything. You have to actually take the inlay out. And you've got a brief summary of controls and what things are worth and that sort of thing. So these are fairly sort of no-frills releases by Atari, but they were, in some cases, quite nice ports. We've seen a couple of ones that are a little bit dodgy, like the port of Final Legacy is obviously inferior to the Atari 8-bit and 5200 versions, but this one's actually pretty good. This is a nice version of Asteroids for the Atari ST. So let's go play Asteroids Deluxe. Okay, here we are with Asteroids Deluxe, developed by Paradox Software, like many of the Atari ST Atari ports. And as I say, it's quite interesting to see this being a port of Asteroids Deluxe rather than just the standard Asteroids. If you've watched the Atari A to Z series, you'll know that Asteroids Deluxe is actually the official sequel to Asteroids. And it added a bunch of new features to the game. It's still played in basically a very similar way, but it was presented a little bit more nicely. So it had this nice sort of blue vector look to it. The original arcade machine also had like a background to it as well. So it's like a background behind the vector display. So it made it look like there was a lot more detail than there really was. And there were a few new gameplay elements, such as the multi-part enemies that we'll hopefully encounter shortly. Now, as I said in the intro, this ST version deliberately eschews the vector graphics look of the original in favour of something a little bit closer to the Atari 7800 version. Oh god, stop. Which actually I think is probably my favourite version of Asteroids. Asteroids generally is not a game that I super love or anything like that, but out of all the versions I've played, and I've now played a lot of versions of Asteroids on these various Atari A to Z series, The Atari 7800 version, which is available on the Evercade, is probably my favourite, I think. And the reason why I bring that one up is the 7800 version actually sort of introduced the idea of these bitmapped, almost 3D looking animated asteroids, rather than either the vector graphics we'd seen in the arcade originals, or the filled coloured objects we'd seen in the 2600 version and the 5200 version and the Atari 8-bit version prior to that. So it was like a significant step forwards in terms of presentation that was then carried on into this Atari ST version as well. Right, let's play again and try and do a little bit better. So in this version of Asteroids you don't have hyperspace. You have the shield, which you've seen me use a couple of times already. And you use that by pulling back on the joystick. And that remains active until you fire another shot. It's only got a limited duration though. You'll notice up in the top left of the screen there's a little red bar that shows you how much longer the shield is going to last. In the arcade original you had to judge that based on how bright the shield was around your ship. But so that actual readout of how much shield you've got left is new to the Atari ST version. And quite helpful. Not 100% sure. Oops! Oh god, getting knocked well off course. Not 100% sure how you restore it, or indeed if you can restore it. Oh dear. Well, you get it restored when you lose a life, so that's something. Do you restore it when you switch levels though? Let's drain a bit and then finish the level and see what happens. Or I could die. Alright, drain that shield. Drain it. No, you don't get it replenished when you change level. So you have to be a bit careful with using that, I guess. If you can only replenish it by actually dying. I have a feeling it came back over time in the arcade version. But what you have to remember is at this time in gaming history, people making arcade ports weren't necessarily working in a situation where they had the original arcade machine to be able to refer to. And more often than not, those arcade conversions ended up becoming a sort of interpretation of the arcade machine rather than an actual accurate port. And while back in the day that was a little bit frustrating, from a modern perspective I actually find that really fascinating. And it makes it much more worthwhile to check out all the different versions of various games like Asteroids and Millipede and Centipede that they were available back at the time, because some of them are significantly better than others, or some of them you might find yourself enjoying significantly more than others. If you've been keeping up with the Atari A to Z flashback series, you will have seen the Atari 5200 version of Millipede, and how much I enjoyed that compared to some of the other versions. So yeah, it's worth checking out those other versions. Now, I remember picking up this version of this game, and I have no idea why this has stuck in my memory. But it was from a time when my family went to visit a guy called Les Ellingham, who was the editor of Page 6 magazine from its birth to its untimely demise. And I believe last I heard of Les, he was making sort of wood carvings and stuff inspired by Native American stuff, so I don't know if he's still doing that, but that certainly is what he got into after Page 6 stopped being a thing. And Page 6 lasted for a very, very long time, and my father and my brother were writing for it right up until the end, pretty much. And I mentioned a few times on this series that I contributed a few things as well over the years, although I was still quite young at the time, so I didn't sort of have any great commitments at the time. But anyway, the reason that this game is relevant is, as I say, my family were visiting Les for one reason or another. I think just a social visit, I think. And for some reason, he just wanted to offload some of the excess software that he had. And he had a bundle of these Atari ports for the Atari ST. And that included this version of Asteroids. Included Cracked. It also included what I remember being a pretty good version of Moon Patrol, but I haven't played it in years, so I don't know quite how good it actually is, how well that holds up. And also, there was an all-original game in there as well, called Moonbase. There was a strange sort of combination between a strategy game and a space shooter. I haven't revisited that for a long time, but I remember enjoying that quite a bit back in the day, despite not being 100% on the mechanics. So that's one we'll have to have a look back at some point. And Asteroids Deluxe particularly sticks in my mind because I remember being a little disappointed by it back in the day because, as we mentioned in the intro, a lot of these games that Atari put out and that Paradox Software ported for them were very, very late. This was sort of late 80s that they were doing this, and by that point, a lot of people, including myself, were starting to think that sort of, well, we're beyond Asteroids by this point. All these many and varied and wonderful and complex games that we have on the Atari ST. We've got strategy games, we've got flight simulators and stuff. And we've got Asteroids, which is from the 1970s. And so, although I remember members of my family being impressed by the animated asteroids in this, I remember not actually liking it all that much. Particularly because the graphics and sound, aside from those asteroids, are not super impressive in this. I mean, you've got that droning in the background, which, yes, is authentic to Asteroids, but it's not a very nice sound. And the shots and the explosion sounds are a bit weedy in this. Obviously, now from one perspective, I know that's just the nature of the ST sound chip. Those are the noises that the ST was capable of making of. Yes, we could have had some sampled sound, maybe. But for one reason or another, we didn't. And in fact, in the grand scheme of Paradox Software's other ports for Atari in the era, this is actually a pretty good one. I mean, it runs pretty well. It's not super smooth or anything like that, but it does run reasonably well. The controls are responsive. It plays well. It plays authentically like Asteroids. And it's a solid implementation of the things that distinguished Asteroids Deluxe from its predecessor. And so looking back on it today, I can appreciate this a lot more. Because I'm no longer in that original context where Asteroids felt dated. Playing Asteroids on a 16-bit computer like the Atari ST felt almost like a waste. But now, of course, as I've talked about numerous times on the various video series and podcasts and things that I've done, if you can divorce something from its original context and just enjoy it on its own terms, you'll often find yourself having a much better time with it. And that's very much true here. I'm actually enjoying this a lot more than I did back in the day. I still like the 7800 version a lot more, followed by the 5200 version, followed by the arcade version, followed by the 2600 version, which I think is kind of rubbish, to be honest. Oh god. It's all gone horribly wrong. But yeah, this is a solid version of Asteroids that I think works pretty well. Let's have one more go, and then we'll wrap up for today, because there's only so much more I can say about this, really. As I say, late it may have been. But in comparison to Paradox's other stuff, this is pretty good. Certainly a lot better than that travesty of a port they did of Final Legacy. That was horrendous. You know what though, I was sort of glad about that, because I have such fond memories of the Atari 8-bit version that if I'd found out I could have been playing a way better Atari ST version all these years, I would have been a bit upset. And so to discover that the Atari ST version was actually a bit crap, yeah, that felt good. That felt good. I don't know a ton about the history of Paradox software, but they seem pretty prolific in the ST era. And we had quite a few games by them. We had Haunted House, which we've seen on this series previously, which is the public domain game that you can't finish because they didn't program it correctly. There's also Space Station, which was basically a reskinned Haunted House. That one actually was released as a commercial piece of software, I think. There was Chopper X, which I remember really enjoying, but a lot of people seem to mock these days for being... One more go. A lot of people seem to mock these days for being a poor quality vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up. And in retrospect, I may have only liked Chopper X because of the fact that you could connect a keyboard to the Atari ST's MIDI port and play all the music through your keyboard instead of through the Atari speakers. Which, come on, that's pretty cool. That was actually a pretty common thing for Paradox software to do. Because you could do that with Haunted House and with Space Station as well. And that was cool. That was sort of my first contact with the very PC idea of using an external device to make your sounds better. Which obviously became a really big thing with the MS-DOS era of PCs, and then continued on into the Windows era. when we had discrete sound cards and that sort of thing. That was obviously before we have the highly integrated solutions that we have these days. But yeah, those games were my first contact with being able to use an external device, in this case a keyboard. Or I guess you could have just hooked it up to a MIDI module as well if you had one, but we did not, so... the Yamaha PSS 680 it was. It was only a single channel of MIDI though. So you could only play back the music on a single instrument sound. And so I used to spend quite a bit of time sort of picking and choosing what the best instrument sound for the Chopper X soundtrack and the Space Station soundtrack and stuff was. Anyway, none of that is anything to do with this game. I think we've pretty much exhausted everything I'd want to talk about with this for now. That is Asteroids Deluxe for Atari ST. Put out by Atari as part of that range of very late ports that they did, and developed by Paradox Software. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.